Hey folks, today I'm going to show you how to make a clean psytrance bass using sampler in Ableton. So what we're aiming for today is something that sounds like this, and it looks like this in an oscilloscope. So it's very clean, it's got a nice transient everywhere, and it's just a very easy to use bass that sounds nice. So how do we do this? Our end goal is here, but I'm going to recreate this step by step so you understand the process. So what you want to do is, number one, you set up a single continuous note. In this case, I chose G, but obviously just choose whatever key your track is in. Then you open up Serum, you set it up to be a saw wave, make sure to turn randomization off, start the phase at 0 degrees or wherever you happen to like the sound. And at this point, what you're going to have, if you don't have all of this other stuff, is just a simple saw wave. Obviously, this is a great starting point for any psytrance bass, almost any psytrance bass. And what you want to do next is a little bit of phase magic here. So this is the stuff that gives it that punchy kind of clicky thing at the beginning that's so common nowadays in psytrance basses. So I have another video where I cover these here. These are little kind of multi-band shaper things that cause phase rotations around each of these frequencies. I have a little bit of EQing to take out some low end, and I just have a transient shaper slightly kind of increasing that clickiness at the beginning. But a lot of this is just up to your taste. The most important piece is really the phase rotation stuff, as well as arguably taking out the low end is also generally a good idea. So when you do this, you'll end up with something like this, where you have this lovely transient here. So that's what you're aiming for. So what you'd want to do is bounce that, and you'll end up with a wave that roughly looks like this. Pretty typical shape for the sort of phasey saw wave, where it sounds like a saw wave, but it has this clicky transient, which is super important at the beginning. Because what that ends up giving is kind of more high-end information here and more sub here. So to drive that home, as a matter of fact, this is an interesting way to see it. So without all this phase stuff, whoops, with a low-pass filter on the whole mix, you can see that the sub starts immediately, right? But as soon as you turn on some of this phase stuff, especially these two things here are going to be impacting that the most, the sub starts a little bit later. And that's really important because now you have high end here at the beginning where you don't see the sub, but the sub starts afterwards. And that gives it kind of almost a kick-like punch, which gives a lot of separation on the low end so that when you have a full mix, you kind of have distinct notes, which is really important for that rolling feel. Well, optionally, if you want that. In my opinion, it sounds good, and that's what a lot of artists do. You could have it be like a steady, continuous something, but generally that's just a little bit less groovy. So it's good to have that sort of separation. And you get that high-end click at the beginning, which is just so satisfying. So once you've generated a wave like this, it'll look approximately like this. I have these two waves here that I've prepared that I like more, so I'm going to use those, but it's the same thing. Then what you want to do is take a sampler from Ableton, and you drag your wave in here. Then let's copy this rolling pattern. This is just 3 notes at G in this case. And well, we kind of recreate this step by step, so it's gonna not sound right at the beginning for a variety of reasons. So first of all, it's too low, so we just need to make sure that the root is down here. Now we're in a pretty good spot without the low pass filter applied. Then, step by step, there's a lot of things you need to fix. So first of all, just turn off all these filters and other stuff. So that's already much closer. Then, now you're actually already a lot of the way done, because the only other thing that's kind of core to what we're doing here is adding a Serum FX. You drag it in like this. Oops. Serum 2 nowadays. I forgot about that. So we want Serum 2 FX. Serum 1 works fine too, it doesn't matter, but yes, so you have Serum 2. And then the trick here is you group them, and you want to insert a new chain here. Do external instrument. This is kind of a neat way to route MIDI in Ableton. Even though it's called external instrument, honestly, it's just useful for routing MIDI to different tracks. In this case, our track is called Recreation. We're going to route the MIDI to Recreation to the Serum 2 FX. This allows us to trigger envelopes within this Serum 2 FX instance. Now, naturally, it doesn't do anything yet, but the magic happens here where now you can have your filter envelopes here after the sampler. So still using the lovely, lovely Serum interface that we all know and love, but you can make your envelopes in here. Let's bring this down to 80 milliseconds or something like that. Bring the sustain down, the usual. And there you go. Now we're in psytrance-based territory. So we have that lovely transient, everything sounds great. Now this isn't really the best sound, to be honest. There's a lot of different things you can improve, so let's go through them one by one. Number one, you probably want to actually set this up maybe a little bit down here and then give it that lovely click by setting up an LFO here, setting that to envelope and bringing up this. And now we have that lovely high-end click. So without it and with it. So you can kind of mess with it, see what you like. Then you can also maybe have another sort of cleanup envelope here. Combined, these are basically like an 18 dB per octave filter, but this just gives it a little bit more control, so I like doing it this way. Right, then you probably want to do this. There you go, this is already sounding pretty good. This is just a solid, decent psytrance bass. So if you look at, oops, wrong one is playing. So of course you need to volume match it and do all the other stuff, but you're getting pretty close here. Oops, too loud. Alright, so immediately we run into a problem here, right? This is, of course, not okay. So you'd want to sidechain this somehow, or use velocity to kind of remove the amplitude of the first one. So what you can do is, well, exactly what I just said. Make sure that the velocity works the way that you would expect. So you'd have to go into your, right here, used to 35% because that's the default and simpler, but well, now the whole thing is more loud, and here you go. That looks about right. You want them to be roughly the same volume. That's a matter of taste. Right, so this is pretty much the most important part of this video, so if this is all you needed to know, then feel free to skip ahead, or rather, skip the rest of the video, because this is kind of the core part of it. But if you're interested in more tips, then stay around because I have a lot more interesting things to show. So now for some tips. Tip number one is, you'll notice this still isn't perfect, despite the fact that I lowered the velocity on the first note. Here it is without the kick. It's lower, but, well, when the kick plays, it still kind of has a lot of this sort of extra stuff here. So they're aligned in phase, so that's not exactly the problem. Well, they could be aligned a little bit better, but that's really not what I'm getting at here. The problem is really just that your sub is playing at the same time as when the kick is playing. So without the bass, we have the kick going through here, and then we have, without the kick, we have this bass here. So there's sub playing here as well. So one trick you can do optionally, and this is just kind of up to you, but mix and match what you like more, you can go into your wave generator here and bounce a version of the same wave with all the same phase rotation and so on, so it sounds consistent, but with a saw wave with the first, with the fundamental removed here. So when you play this, you'll see that it's actually, there's just no fundamental here, it's completely taken out. So this is good because you don't want to EQ to do this sort of thing because it'll kind of change the timbre of your bass. EQing also causes phase changes and so on, so if you want it to sound consistent, this is the best way to do it. It'll be exactly the same but with no sub. And then once you've done that, this is why I prefer sampler for this method, by the way, rather than simpler, because you can do this multiple sample stuff here. So what you'd want to do is take the wave that you generated that has no sub and drag it in here to demonstrate rather than doing it from scratch. Let me just show you what I've done here. I have a zone, or rather two zones, like this, and we have a version with the sub and a version without the sub, and they're separated with kind of a velocities here. So for your version with the sub, you have it playing at the higher velocities, and without it at the lower velocities. So in other words, anything that has a velocity of 89 or less will have no sub, and anything above that will have the sub. It doesn't have to be 89, this is just kind of a random number I picked here, because it works for the loudness levels in this track and with this sample. But the gist of it is the same. low velocities will allow you to just conveniently take out the sub. So now with this example, if we look at it, it's using the same waves, by the way, as above here, so no trickery. So if you look at this now, it's got no sub. So this is great because now you kind of still have that transient, but the sub doesn't mess with it. So honestly, this is kind of optional, but it's a very useful trick so that, there you go, let's just turn into this version here. Now it sticks out a little bit less. Arguably I could do phase alignment a little bit better here, but it's not the purpose of this video. So that was the first tip, taking out the sub with this extra sample. It's a really easy way to do it and very convenient because then you don't have to worry so much about getting the exact volume right of this one just to kind of be loud enough but not mess with the kick and so on and so forth. Naturally, for this sort of sidechaining, you can always also just use something like this, like a typical sidechain, you know, LFO tool style thing. Just honestly optional. There really isn't like the right answer here. Whatever you want to do with this first 16th note is highly personal preference. So do whatever you like and whatever sounds good. The next tip involves some details around when exactly the bass ends. So if you'll note here, there is no space in between each of these notes. They blend into each other. This is not necessarily a problem because what's nice about using a sampler is if you turn it on to one voice here, then you make sure that, well, essentially when another note comes in, another bass note comes in, this one will just completely replace this one. So in other words, this one completely stops playing and now this one starts. And that's why the transient is not problematic. But personally, it still is a little too close for my taste. And on top of that, it might also not be exactly the sound that you're going for. So a trick that you can do is you can use this neat Max for Live device called Crisco Note Shortener, which allows you to do exactly what it says. It shortens your notes. So whatever MIDI you have, it's kind of the same thing as going into your MIDI and manually kind of doing this by like, 10 milliseconds or whatever you set it up to be. But who wants to go in and change every note like that, right? So instead get this thing, shorten your notes, and now you see that there's this space here. So without it, and with. On top of that, it does also do something a little bit cleaner with the sampler here. So in any case, you would probably want to do something like this. When you do this, just keep in mind what your release time is here. So when you have this shortening on, right now each MIDI note is shortened by 10 milliseconds. So it kind of makes sense to have a release of 10 milliseconds, so it kind of gradually fades out right up until that one, or right up until the next note. Otherwise it just kind of ends. But here we can make it a little bit smoother. But if you make it too long, it does actually seem to kind of eat into the next one. So just be careful with that. Kind of the very beginning does kind of get messed up, so hard to say exactly what's going on under the hood here, but definitely to be safe, I prefer using something like this. So yeah, either shorten them manually or use this thing, and then just make sure that this release time matches up with your shortened time. The next tip involves some tricks around how to make your bass sound better. So, for example, a few things you can do here. Since we're using just a regular instance of Serum, just kind of the sound is being generated somewhere else, but everything else is exactly the same. You can do things like downsampling or distortion or anything like that. So you can even just do the typical Serum thing where you set up like a macro to the downsampling. You have like some fat downsampling here if you want to do anything else in here. So then you can just automate this stuff and have cool bass lines. And kind of on top of this, I'm going to demonstrate a very simple bassline that uses this trick and a few others that I'll go over right now, so bear with me for just another minute. Another thing you can do is use something like a Haas widener of some kind. This one's using this kilohertz Haas thing, but I mean, there's a million of these, it doesn't matter. So you can use something like this to widen it. Just be careful because this will screw up the mono compatibility, but in certain situations, this allows you to really push that width. And if you are okay with kind of a weird comb filtered sound a little bit, then you can get a ton of stereo width in certain key situations, which can sound really cool. as long as you're just okay with messing up the mono compatibility just a little bit. And I think that's fine sometimes. Or if you want to be safer, you know, slap a wider on it. Just make sure to get rid of that low here. So make it a little bit wider. Just more fun that way. So now to demonstrate how some of these techniques can come together to do something cool, you can see this bassline, or rather listen to it. Oops, need to turn on this thing, and I'll explain what that is in a second. So what's going on here? So the MIDI itself is pretty simple. We just have some notes, you know, and some octave jumps, nothing too crazy here. But what's going on is we're using, oops, oh, I forgot to enable this downsampling, so here. There you go. That sounds even cooler. Okay, you can turn on downsampling and so on. What I'm trying to illustrate here is we're kind of combining all of these methods at the same time here. If you look at the automation, so let's look at this guy, let's look at this one, let's look at this one. Oops. New lane here. There you go. So anyways, we have some downsampling that turns on here, wider turns off, the width turns on, we have all this other things. This is unnecessary. So you can kind of mix and match. So now to explain the rest of what's going on here, because naturally this is only part of it. The next thing that's going on is I have a little custom MIDI device here, Max for Live device. You don't really need this, and I'll definitely cover this in another video. The gist of it is just that you can do mod wheel stuff and pitch bend stuff here conveniently rather than just going into here and messing with it in here. I just like to see everything on the overall grid arrangement view rather than going into clip view. But yeah, don't worry about that too much. The point is you can do mod wheel and pitch bends. There you go. So now you have cool pitch bends and mod wheel stuff. So the pitch bends are pretty self-explanatory. You can bring it down. It's going down at pitch here, going up here, going down there. So you can do something fun like that and mix and match with all these other techniques. And then for the mod wheel, this is actually one of the reasons I really like using this approach here, because it almost feels like you're using Serum. It's just cleaner because you bounced the wave already. So what I did here is simply mapped the mod wheel to the cutoff here. So pretty self-explanatory. Higher mod wheel means more higher filter cutoff. That's how you get that kind of really crispy sound. Right, for instance, here kind of. So also just kind of a matter of personal preference. Right, do whatever you like. Doesn't matter. But it's really fun, and that's how a lot of these basses and kind of modern progressive psytrance, they do a lot of these kind of wiggly, pitchy, moddy stuff. That's what gives them that really fun character. And then the last piece that really ties all this stuff together is I have just a simple sidechain tool here. It can be this, it can be LFO tool or whatever else. Just when using LFO tool or other similar plugins, just be aware that Ableton is really bad at compensating for latency. So if you have any latency inducing stuff here, which well, technically this introduces a tiny little bit of latency actually, so that's already, I guess, hypothetically a problem. But the point is I just like using this because this is completely sample accurate and doesn't run into any ridiculous Ableton latency issues. So you just have a sidechain trigger up here, and that way you can kind of trigger each volume envelope to be the way you need it to and not interfere with the kick, because without it, so obviously the kick and the bass are just completely killing each other here, so much more smooth. Yeah, so this is kind of a demonstration of how to use all of these things, you know, tie them together, have a cool bass line. And one thing that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that despite all these octave jumps, the bass still sounds consistent and good. And that's what my favorite part about using the sample-based approach is, because when you have a sample, it'll get shifted up and down, but its fundamental character will stay the same, and the phase, kind of the shape of the waveform will also stay the same. So you won't need to worry about it sometimes getting asymmetrical and going, whoops, way above here, or way down here or something, depending on what pitch it's playing. It's just kind of always going to be the same and sound very consistent. So I really like that. Very clean, very consistent, always, you know, starting at the same spot. Just a great way to have a easily controllable bass. So yeah, I think that's it for the tips in this video. I hope this came in handy. Let me know if you want me to cover anything else. I'm happy to go over this stuff. And hope you have a wonderful day.